Hello, everybody. This is Georgianne Hughes, and this is The Bite Show. And it's a real blessing, believe me, to have Joseph P. Farrell with us tonight. And go to Joseph's website. It is GizaDeathStar.com. There is a PayPal button on Joseph's website. And I would like to ask the listeners to make use of that PayPal button. That's why it's there. It's very rare that we have researchers and authors of the quality of Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. And tonight we have a lot to talk about. We're going to get into our part 2 of our Dirty Secrets series. I can't help it, Joseph. And that is otherwise known as Nazi International. And the Nazis' post-war plan to control finance, conflict, physics, and space. And Joseph, I think they've really worked hard on this, and we're watching some of the most grandiose manipulations of financial markets.
Yes.
Of any time ever in this world.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the manipulation to me again smacks too much of a group of people in a panic, in a real panic.
Yeah.
Because, number one, their models are breaking down. They can't make accurate forecasts and so on. But number two, as I indicated in the previous talk, I think that someone else is holding the gun to their head and calling in a lot of markers. And the only thing historically that in recent years presents itself to me as having had a lot of cash that this international Anglo-American corporate elite would have loved to get their hands on for their own nefarious purposes was the Nazi International. And, you know, mob style, that money is going to come with a whole lot of conditions.
Whoa, yes. Yes, exactly.
So, you know, I think that someone is calling in the markers, quite literally, and they're scrambling to figure out what to do about it. And it's a story in itself if it can be documented. I'm not sure that it can, but anyway, that's my take.
Well, you know, it would be very difficult too, because we'd have to have the finest teams plural, of economists,
right,
bookkeepers,
right,
mathematicians,
right,
to figure out all the front corporations that they've thrown up,
right,
all of the, you know, peeling back the layers of the onion, as it were.
Right, right.
I mean, it's brilliant how they've done this.
Well, yeah, to a certain extent it is. There is an agency of the U.S. government called FinCEN, F-I-N-C-E-N, that tracks this sort of stuff. And certainly they would have the wherewithal to have their finger on a great deal of the pulse, but apparently they're not talking. It's a very secretive agency. And my guess is that they're seeing probably some indications of this kind of factional infighting scenario that I've outlined.
Well, okay, let's look at this guy that's been in the news.
Mm-hmm.
This Madoff?
Right.
Yeah. They say that that's a really brilliant scheme that he came up with. And I imagine there's a lot more of those out there.
Oh, yes, I'm sure there are.
They just haven't been uncovered yet.
Right. Right. I'm sure there are.
But with the way the Nazis do things, they don't spare anyone or anything. I mean, how do they set their stuff up, Joseph? I mean, they have all these front things that you have to go through, and then you find these dummy corporations and stuff. How, in your research, I mean, what did you find, or what did you notice?
Well, again, I go back to that 1944 meeting that took place at the Hôtel Maison Rouge in Strasbourg, France, that Barton Bormann, essentially through a surrogate, outlined his strategic evacuation plan. As a result of that plan, we do know what the Treasury at the time was able to uncover was about 750 dummy corporations that were located mostly outside of Germany in places like Portugal, Spain, Turkey, and so on and so forth, that essentially were set up to do nothing but launder money out of Nazi Germany, and at the same time launder or protect some of their patents that Bormann was interested in protecting. So we uncovered that, but there's indication, and I mentioned this in the Nazi International, from another American researcher that I respect very highly, a fellow by the name of Carter Heydrich, that indicates that what we really uncovered was probably only what Bormann wanted us to uncover. In other words, that the investigation really only found the tip of the iceberg, because after all, let's look at the case of I.G. Farben, just in this context.
Okay.
That cartel was so big and so powerful that it took no less than 51 years to forcibly liquidate. In other words, it was not liquidated. This German Nazi conglomerate was so powerful that it wasn't really finally liquidated until the year 2003.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. So, when you're dealing with something this big, with an entity that big, that has so many corporate subsidiaries, dummy companies, front companies, holding companies, patent agreements, license agreements, and so on and so forth, you literally have to take a great deal of time to sort all of this mess out to be able to do it. So in other words, you would find I.G. Farben shares traded on stock exchange in Germany up until very recently. People were still trading that stuff.
Yeah.
Because as a legal entity, it still existed, and that meant that it had control still over all of those licensing agreements and royalty arrangements and so on and so forth that it was party to. So that's just one example. Now, if you can imagine doing this on a scale that Bormann did it at the end of the war with 750 dummy corporations that we know of.
That we know of.
Yeah. You add all this together, and you've got a real powerhouse of a covert organization that, I take great pains to document in the book, actually did exist and probably still does. So, all of this stuff, again, like I say, the only thing historically that I can see that would indicate another faction in play after the war, besides the Anglo-American corporate elite, the typical Rockefeller, Rothschild axis, is this Nazi International. And the example that they were in cahoots, at least for a period of time, is the fact that, I mentioned in the first part of this series, is that Bormann cashed checks on his own name, through Rockefeller and Morgan banks.
Yeah.
And it was cleared through Deutsche Bank, which is another big financial powerhouse on the international scene. So, all of this points to me that there was a détente, an agreement that was made, and the signal historical event that kind of testifies to this is the founding of the Bilderberger Group by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. Now, he was invited to do this by David Rockefeller.
Yeah.
Okay, but now let's look at who Prince Bernhard really is. He's a German. He is an officer of the SS, and he's a vice president of, you guessed it, I.G. Farben. Okay?
Oh, yes.
And one of the other significant figures in those early Bilderberg meetings was the Deutsche Bank chairman by the name of Dr. Hermann Josef Abs. Okay?
Yeah.
So in other words, to me, the Bilderberger Group looks like it was founded precisely in order after the war to coordinate this massive influx of Nazi monies into the American and British banks that would then launch them and, in return, get the use of that massive influx of funds for their own purposes, okay?
Mm-hmm.
That, to me, is exactly what's going on in the Bilderberger Group, because what you find in their meetings and minutes of those early meetings is what they're going to do in Europe. In other words, the whole thing was set up to basically foster and help along the European Union, which was precisely one of the goals of Martin Bormann. If you read what I wrote in the Nazi International correctly, I mentioned the fact that Bormann wanted to create a European confederation after the war, which Germany would then be in a position to dominate by virtue of its dominant position as the premier European economic and military power. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So this is exactly what we see has happened historically. So for a period of time, this idea of regionalization, which is certainly also part of the philosophy of Rockefeller and Rothschild and groups like this is exactly what you see transpiring. So they can afford to make common cause. This is my point. But human nature being human nature, Georgianne, the closer they get to their goal, the more those factions will want to be the dominant faction within whatever order emerges. This is why I think you see serious signs of factional infighting. And, thank goodness for the Russians, because they know who really was behind the whole sad period of their history that was called communism. They know that there were very powerful American and British financial interests behind it. They know that there were Zionist interests behind it. And yet, in throwing off communism, they have realized, and you can go to Russia, and this is a matter of open discussion there, unlike over here. You can find them being very aware of the attempts of that Western corporate elite to get Russia back under their wing. And, of course, Putin will have none of it.
Good.
Okay? And, good. More power to him. And in a certain sense, I've heard many people on different talk shows in recent weeks saying that in many respects, Russia is a much more free country today than is America.
Yes, I've heard that many times.
Yeah. And I think it's because you have this still very nationalistic spirit in Russia. You also have a different kind of Christian culture that's behind Russia than is behind the Christianity of the West, and that's certainly a major factor. But you also have, with people like Putin and the people that he has nurtured into power, you have someone with a very definitely Russian nationalistic stance who realizes what the powers that be in the Western world really are and how insidious they really are, and who has attempted to mentor into positions of power inside of Russia people who do not share that viewpoint. Okay, this is the real conflict that's shaping up. So, this is why I think you have not only on the geopolitical stage some serious divisions within this new world order, because I just don't think Asia is going to go along with it, and I include Russia in that statement. But the other thing is you have this post-war détente, so to speak, between what I call the Nazi International, which really is the only power in Europe after the war that does have any financial clout. This is the sad reality of it. And this Anglo-American corporate elite, I think that détente is breaking down. That's quietly and behind the scenes, but nevertheless definitely is the case.
Well, Joseph, it's almost, I don't know, Russia was communist.
Right.
Now they are not communist, and we are. So what has happened? I mean, how did this... was that all planned, or what happened?
Well, I don't think that, that Russia's not being part of the plan anymore was planned. I think that by some strange accident of history and perhaps even a bit of foresight on the part of the people that eventually emerged as the power base in Russia, that you had certainly an attempt was made by the Anglo-American corporate elite immediately in the wake of the collapse of communism, and especially under the corrupt Yeltsin government, to make significant inroads into the Russian nation and more or less balkanize it as part of this new world order. Well, that didn't work because the Russians, of course, have a considerably large intelligence service, and they are not above summarily getting rid of, let's put it that way, people that they do not want to see in power. And I think, that case of the Russian that died a couple of years back with the polonium poisoning.
Yes.
I think that was a distinct message from Putin to that Anglo-American corporate elite. I think it was a little warning shot across the bow. Don't keep playing this game or we'll take all of you out. And if you've listened to the fellow by the name of Benjamin Fulford, used to be a reporter for Forbes magazine, he has indicated a similar message is being sent by Chinese and Japanese secret societies, again, to the Anglo-American corporate elite that, okay, if you want to play this game, be aware that it's going to cost many of you your lives.
Well, how do we get rid of these leeches? I mean, they suck the blood out of everything and everybody.
The problem is that people do not have an adequate understanding or philosophy of money. Okay?
Yes.
And they don't realize what a blight on humanity throughout human history, I mean back to earliest times, this mercantile banking class has really been. The Rothschilds and the Rockefellers are merely the latest in a long train of abuses, if I can quote the Declaration of Independence. Because this goes way back. If you go back to ancient times, if you go back to Rome, even as recent as the Roman Empire, you will find that the power to make and coin money was always perceived to be in the hands of the state. Okay?
Yes.
And yet, if you go back to ancient records and examine them carefully, you can also see at almost all stages of history that there is the existence of some private mercantile class that's issuing private money, okay, and attempting to subvert the power of the state to do that. All throughout history. I mean, you can go back to Egyptian times, you can go back even in China, believe it or not, which had a fairly sophisticated monetary system very early on. You can find this effort being made, and what it looks like to me, I'll go a step further. What it looks like to me is at the very earliest stages, this class, this interest, if you will, was international in its outlook. In other words, it was not viewing itself as beholden to any particular state or any particular system of pantheonic gods or what have you. But the other peculiar parallel is that it also appears to have existed either inside of or through the various state religions that existed back then.
Yeah.
Made use of them, so to speak. The sanctity of the temple. You have the warning of Christ against the money changers in the temple.
Right.
Well, this is not believe it or not, is not a unique instance or example. It goes all throughout ancient history and almost all cultures. So I think people have to understand that money is nothing more than a medium of exchange, and that there is absolutely no reason whatsoever that any unit of exchange should ever be encumbered with debt.
Yeah.
Our founding fathers saw that very clearly when they drew up the Constitution and said very specifically that Congress shall have the power to make and coin money and, note the next phrase, regulate the value thereof. In other words, it was a matter of law, not a matter of public law, not a matter of a bunch of private corporate interests doing so. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is the big struggle. It's been going on throughout history between this international class and those that are loyal to a national culture, a system of law, a system of state privilege, and so on and so forth. And the most recent example of this struggle, again, believe it or not, is World War II. Because one of the very first things that Hitler did, Georgianne, was, in spite of the fact that he did take loans and so on from these international bankers, he put Nazi Germany itself, more or less, on a system of state-made and regulated money. So, in other words, the debt to bankers was almost virtually eliminated. And, by the time, by May of 1941, things are looking really bleak for the bankers, because after helping this guy into power, all of a sudden, by that period of history, he's overrun most of Europe. And what he hasn't overrun, he's made allies. Okay? And he's getting ready for the big push into the Soviet Union. So, there is no way that any, the Franco-British alliance virtually collapsed within less than a year after the start of the war. So, Britain was not capable of taking out Germany by itself. And to my mind, many people will debate me on this, but to my mind, not even the Soviet Union was capable of doing it by itself. It required everybody getting in on the act and putting that thing down.
Yeah.
Because imagine if, for a moment, what might have happened, grisly as the thought is in terms of the human suffering involved, but imagine in terms of the economic system of the world what might have happened had Nazi Germany won. It would have meant that a major power had successfully thrown off the connection between this banking class, this corporate class, and the nation state. It would have assumed, again, a kind of a Roman imperial attitude toward international finance. And that just would have not set too well with certain people sitting on top of their bank towers in New York City and London.
Yeah. True.
So it's a very, very big story, and it's one of the dirtiest secrets. But, getting back to the lessons of history, we have been warned time and again in our nation's history against giving the power of the unit of exchange of the nation over to a private financial interest. Over and over and over again, we have been warned about this.
Right.
Most of the time unsuccessfully. Okay? But if you track the movements of these people in foisting the Bank of the United States back in the 1800s on us, and then later the Federal Reserve, they have always had to do so with deception. Always. They cannot come out and be honest. These are not, therefore, honest people.
Right. Exactly. Well, look at the debt. Somebody is profiting hugely off this. And, I've been told, too, Joseph, that the birth certificate thing, that they sell these by the bundles to foreign countries. Why would the Department of Commerce have to do with your birth certificate?
Well, yes, exactly. This whole scheme is a Ponzi scheme. It has been that way from the beginning, because if you have X amount of dollars and then that X amount of dollars is encumbered not only as principal but with interest debt, okay, then you can never ever in that scheme of things repay it. Only the very few at the very top are going to enrich themselves from this system.
Yes.
And the other thing reason I say that this system is breaking down is that in creating this global empire, the United States and Great Britain in the last, 5 to 6 centuries, in doing so, we have increasingly impoverished whole areas of the world.
Yes.
Okay?
True.
And people are turning against us. Now, the sad fact is they're turning against the nation rather than turning against the people that are running this nation, namely that corporate elite.
Yes.
If and when they do wake up and realize that it's those people that are really doing this, not the average American or the average Briton or the average Frenchman or what have you.
Right.
Once they realize that this is the game that's going on, I think those bankers' days are numbered. And there's every indication, again, if you look very carefully at recent history, you will find at various times leaders in Latin America or in Africa or so on being very clear that they understand that this is the real group that they are taking issue with. And, of course, most of those leaders have ended their careers with violent deaths.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But the point being that you cannot kill an idea by killing people.
Right.
It doesn't ever work. The only thing that does is it increases the idea. So, eventually I think not only do you have this factional infighting between the descendants of this Nazi International and the Anglo-American corporate elite that think they're going to run the world, I think you have a groundswell of opinion now turning against them in places like Russia, and certainly I would imagine by now in places like China. It's interesting that China is publishing a whole slew of books, indicting the Rothschilds as part of this international conspiracy and so on and so forth. China, of all places.
Well, good. That's
well, yeah, more power to the Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah.
But this to me is a very encouraging sign. But as a kind of a downside of this, it means that elite is now in a siege mentality. Okay, and that means that their measures are going to be increasingly desperate.
Well, yes, they are going to be increasingly desperate.
Right.
They have no compunction, if we look through history,
no.
of committing genocide against just tens of millions of people in order to stay in power.
Right, right.
How unclean are they? I mean,
the whole game has always been, if you go back to ancient times, the one of the biggest scams in history has been that this class of people in ancient times somehow managed to get everyone thinking of precious metal coins, silver and gold, sometimes copper, bronze, and things like that, as having inherent value as a medium of exchange, okay? Now, in doing that, what they really did is they created a class of essentially bullion brokers who, of course, in order to create the supply that they, essentially created the demand for, to create the supply for that kind of money, they had to have slaves to work the mines. So it was a system inherently dependent on slavery. It has been from the beginning. So, this is their mentality. They've transformed the departments of personnel into the departments of human resources. The whole devaluation of humanity in respect to the increasing valuation of money. Okay?
Yeah.
So their mentality is precisely as you say. They really do look at humanity to a certain extent as nothing but their chattel to be negotiated and bartered and so on and so forth. It's an insidious, perfidious system, but again, I think we are witnessing the demise of this kind of free-for-all predatory capitalism. Now, they want to, in places, so they're some of the people leading that charge, and they want to put in kind of a world corporate socialist state. But I don't think that we can take the view again, I go back to this idea of factional infighting. I don't think that we can take the view that this is a smoothly running plan. I think it's showing distinct signs of having to put retreads on some of the tires, to keep the thing going, to keep the clinking, cluttering, coughing, sputtering engine going, because these are the same people that have for so long suppressed any alternative development of technology in independent hands.
Right.
Okay,
right.
So, to me, it's just a stupid worldview, ultimately, Georgianne, because it's so irrational. It is so contrary to human nature. It is so contrary to just plain nature, and ultimately, it is a completely irrational agenda in that they themselves are cutting the lifeline that feeds them, namely the rest of humanity.
Yeah.
So it's a system inevitably bound to collapse. I think maybe we're partly witnessing the beginning of that collapse. And I don't think the best laid plans of David Rockefeller and all of his cynical bitterness, or Zbigniew Brzezinski, or Edmund de Rothschild, or any of these self-appointed global masters, I think events will outstrip them. Oh, I think the events will just become too fast-paced, too gargantuan for them to be able to manipulate and play their same old silly games. I think they will simply go the way of the dodo bird. I really do.
Well, sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, same here. Amen. Go in peace, but go.
Go in peace,
but get out of here.
Yeah, exactly. But when you look at the structure of this, and I've thought a lot about this, Joseph.
Now, you're talking about your list that we were talking about before the store when you say structure?
Sort of, yeah.
Oh, okay.
The way they set things up with their dummy corporations, hundreds of them fronting something else, and it would take an army of people with a 200 IQ to figure it out.
Right.
But they set up these agencies.
Right.
To do research.
Right.
And like you've put in your book, they will research things like water.
Right.
I look at the World Health Organization.
Right.
Mm-hmm. That's one of them.
Right.
The CDC. There's another one.
Right.
You could go down the list.
Right.
The Cancer Foundation.
Right.
That they've set up.
Right.
It is so huge, Joseph.
Yeah.
Right down to the charities that these people own.
Right.
It's mind-boggling. And then, wait a minute. And then, the CDC say something's going on in the country that they want to happen.
Right.
All they have to do is get the World Health Organization over there or the CDC and say, "Oop, we got an outbreak."
Right.
And then the government has to order vaccines.
Yeah.
See, I mean, it just goes and goes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's all designed to drive their own profit.
Right.
But the agencies and so on, the proliferation of agencies and foundations and grant organizations and so on and so forth, was really something that began in the 19th century when these very super rich families set up all of these foundations and funds, and of course government followed suit then with the agencies that you're talking about.
Right.
And the purpose of them is multifold, as you've already indicated. One, it's a way of keeping their image clean.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's a way of spinning themselves as great philanthropists and benefactors of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
To his credit, the only one that really didn't set up a foundation was old Morgan. He was just a grouch, and everyone knew he was a grouch, and no foundation in the world was going to make him not a grouch anymore.
Right.
But, Rockefeller certainly had his, and Carnegie, and so on and so forth. Well, it's partly to keep their image clean. But secondly, it's, as you indicated, it's to conduct or supervise or oversee research. Now, that has two aspects to it, and I'm glad that you brought this up because it relates directly to the Nazi International, because you'll notice that Bormann did a very sneaky, clever thing at that Hotel Maison Rouge meeting. But the purpose of these research foundations was, first of all, in my opinion, so that they could conduct privately the research that they were suppressing publicly.
Very well put, yes, sir.
The research foundations and grant foundations that steer research are steering, I've noticed this particularly in the case of physics, they promote certain ideas and concepts and research tracks in public consumption physics, while behind the scenes they are busily promoting a completely different one. Okay? So it's a way for them also to spy, to get the pulse of science, to keep themselves abreast on things. Okay? And because there are so many, as you said, it's also a way of compartmentalizing it so that only the people at the very top have a clear picture of the whole.
Right.
Okay? Now, what Bormann does in 1944, you've got again to remember that Bormann is a financial wheeler-dealer of the first rank. He knows all of the big players at the time. He's a personal friend of this Dr. Hermann Josef Ops, who, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the early attendees at the Bilderberger meetings, okay? So Bormann's a personal friend with the chairman of Deutsche Bank, okay? And he knows the head of IG Farben intimately, okay? So he knows how to move massive amounts of money. He knows how this whole game is played. Now, when he comes along at that Hotel Maison Rouge meeting and says that German corporations must set up all of these research foundations to study this and to study that, you'll remember he did a very interesting thing. He said that these would be headed by a liaison officer to the Nazi Party. So in other words, Bormann is signaling one thing, that number one, he understands what the real purpose behind all of these foundations and agencies really is.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? And number two, he is going to spy on it all.
Oh, yeah. Well, look at what's happened in our own country here, Joseph, with the way they have set their little New World Order thing up here in this country.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they've got all these laws in place.
Right.
They can snoop on anything, anywhere, anytime.
Yeah, anytime, right.
Yeah, and they've got czars.
Yeah, czars. Yeah, since when does America need a czar? For anything.
Right. You know, they've got the phone police, the tobacco police, the thought police.
The thought police.
The religion police.
And the religion police.
Yeah.
And we have a war on everything. War on drugs, war on poverty, war on terrorism. Yeah. America is one of the most militant countries in the world. And anybody, you know, you go overseas and then look back at this country and you see it clearly. And again, this whole philosophy that everything has to be a war, well, really, it's a war because during a war, only this class of predators, essentially, that is nothing but this international mercantile banking class, that's all they are, only those people ever profit during a war.
Right.
So, you know, you have millions of people in this country that could benefit from medical marijuana, for example.
Yeah.
But we do not allow it because the real reason is, in order to keep this Ponzi scheme going, Georgianne, drug money itself is such an essential and huge component of it.
Oh, yes.
They would literally be bankrupt without it.
Yeah.
Okay? So you have to ally yourselves then at the very top with this criminal class that preys on human addiction and misery.
Yeah.
So, you know, again, I have not much use for these people. If I were ever to meet David Rockefeller, personally, I doubt I would shake his hand because of what he stands for. He may not himself be personally involved with any of this, but the problem is that his own designs, his own statements, and the class that he is a member of is so counter to anything that any great religion teaches concerning humanity. That I just couldn't bring myself to acknowledge his presence.
Yeah.
Because he, to quote the phrase of C.S. Lewis, he's a man without a chest. He's head, arms, and legs, but no torso, no heart.
No heart. Yeah.
So, and it shows on his face. It shows on his face.
I've seen photos, and I know. I agree. Yes.
It shows on his face.
Just empty.
It's an empty face.
Mm-hmm.
And, I feel sorry for these people in a certain sense because they're so rich, they're so powerful, they're bored. And the only thing they have to do is play world master.
Yeah.
And that can get to be a very dull game after a while.
Yeah.
So, Bormann was exceedingly clever in the way he set his international up. And again, I go back to the point that I make in Secrets of the Unified Field and again in Nazi International. You have the escape of 3 people from Nazi Germany that are significant indicators of what their game plan is. And the 3 people are Bormann himself, Heinrich Müller, and Hans Kammler. Okay? With those 3 people, you have someone who is capable of understanding the game of high finance. That would be Martin Bormann.
Right.
You have someone who knows the game of espionage, intelligence, assassination, forgery, disinformation, that whole game that spies play.
Yeah.
That would be Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo.
Yeah.
Okay? And then finally you have Hans Kammler, someone who is familiar with how to administer very large research projects and keep them absolutely secret. Okay, so with those 3 men, you have a significant indicator of the structure and purpose of this Nazi International. And you'll notice, it's the same game that the Anglo-American corporate elite are playing.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
It's just that he's going to play the same game and be independent. And by the way, we're going to have our SS officer and fellow IG Farben Vice President, Prince Bernhard, found a little group to which we're going to get together with that little Anglo-American elite and plot domination of the world and lend them our money to do it. But like I say, if you're cashing checks on Chase Manhattan and Manufacturers Hanover Bank under your own name, then either they have something on you or you have something on them or both. But when that marker comes due, Mr. Rockefeller, you'd better be able to pay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So I think if you look back now very carefully on events in recent history, you're going to see indications of this European faction and this Anglo-American faction going at loggerheads quietly and behind the scenes. Why do I say that? Well, because Germany is now the world's 2nd largest exporter of sophisticated arms after the United States. Did you know that?
Yes.
Okay. Forget about Russia. It's Germany that is the real other major player in that market. All right? And they've got some, trust me, they have some extraordinarily sophisticated, state-of-the-art arms. Okay? They always had, they always will. Well, prior to the first Gulf War, who is it that's building Saddam Hussein's bunkers? Whose engineers are showing him how to increase the range of their Scud missiles and modify them to carry chemical weapons to hit Israel? And so on and so forth. It's Germany.
Yes.
Who goes in there and kicks all those people out? It's us. Okay? I even think to a certain extent that, and I'm going to go way out on a limb here, and I'm not going to go much in detail why I say this. But everyone views 9/11 as an inside job, okay? And I would certainly be one of those people.
Yeah.
All right. But I think that 9/11 has all the hallmarks of an operation within an operation. Okay?
Yes.
Now, to give people an idea of what I mean by that, let's go back to the Nazi International for a moment. When I discuss Carter Heydrich's scenario of how Martin Bormann made it out of Nazi Germany on that U-boat.
Yeah.
He arranges for a U-boat that's carrying enriched uranium to Japan and infrared proximity fuses, both kind of handy things to have if you're building an A-bomb.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, fun and games.
Oh, fun and games, yes. Well, he arranges for this U-boat to surrender to the United States, okay? So that, if you recall in the book, this U-boat makes its way through the Kattegat between Denmark and Sweden, and 3 times, no less than 3 times, British Royal Air Force aircraft approach this U-boat convoy, illuminate it with flares, and then do what? They don't attack. Okay? Now, to me this means, and I'm following Carter Heydrich here, to me this means that Martin Bormann told the Americans what was on that U-boat, and yes, I'll give it to you, and what we want in exchange is this and that and the other. Okay? So the Americans tell their British allies, don't attack that U-boat convoy. And the British probably shrug their shoulders and say, okay, Uncle Sam wants us not to attack this, so we won't. But in the meantime, we're going to find out why.
Yeah.
So we're going to spy on our American allies, you know. But now what Bormann does, in my opinion, this is where I depart company with Carter Heydrich. What Bormann does is, knowing that the Americans are going to give this U-boat a quote-unquote shield of invisibility,
yeah.
Okay, he smuggles himself out on it, unbeknownst to the Americans or the British.
Yeah.
And he smuggles Heinrich Miller out on it. And who knows, he may have even smuggled Adolf Hitler out on it.
Oh, boy.
So, and under our own security, you know, this is what I mean by an op within an op. He has only revealed part of the plan to the American side. Okay, now let's go back to 9/11. I think that certainly you have indications that some element or group within the American government, or better put, within the American power elite crowd, knew at least part of what the danger was. And may have, let me be very clear here, I'm stressing my language carefully and listen to it carefully, and may have been involved in its planning and execution. Okay? But at some point, someone else got involved in that operation. And under the cloak of one operation, pulled off another. And the other operation was a demonstration of technology that they had.
I agree with you there.
And that technology was demonstrated in the destruction of the World Trade Center towers. Okay? In other words, I do not and never have accepted any of the models that anyone has put out there of airplane fuel doing it or controlled demolitions doing it or what have you. I do not accept those models.
I don't either.
So I think this was the big surprise. Okay? Because let's face it, if planes had flown into those buildings, created a great deal of fire and smoke and damage and so on, but the buildings still stood.
Right.
Okay? Probably they still would have if that were all that had happened.
Right.
Then we probably still would have gone to war, and Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney and Halliburton and everybody else would have had their way. Okay? But because that demonstration was made, the government then and the people that were involved in the first operation, I should be more explicit, not necessarily the government, but the power elite that may have been involved in the first operation, were put into a panic. Because what do they have to do now? If they admit the reality, then they've also admitted that they're not omnipotent and omnicompetent. Okay? And they've admitted that their own power base is under assault from somewhere.
Yeah.
And it ain't a bunch of Arabs.
Well, Joseph, they
it's
don't...
got to be someone. It's got to be someone with an extraordinarily sophisticated technology. And once you have said that, you have narrowed the circle of people, of potential perpetrators of that aspect of the event to a very, very select group of nations, and more importantly, to a very, very select group of people. Mm-hmm. There are only certain scientists that know what this stuff is and how to build it. There are only certain nations capable of doing it. There are only certain nations and groups that have investigated it. We're one of them, incidentally. But there are others.
Yeah.
So my point is if you, again, take the view that there is some serious factional infighting going on, and everybody is now scrambling in the end game to position their faction as the dominant one within this emerging New World Order, you've got some serious problems. And the reason I think that this elite is panicked, you mentioned this vaguely in a previous session, that this bailout has all the hallmarks of someone holding us to blackmail.
Yes, extortion of something.
Extortion.
Yes.
I have a feeling.
Well, maybe we stole something and they want it back.
No, listen very carefully. The reason why I'm taking such a long time to go around Harvey's barn,
yes,
is that how to put it? You mentioned all of these dummy corporations and so on and so forth, and I mentioned that one purpose of them was to launder money.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, now let's look closely at this financial meltdown. A bunch of companies have gone belly up already, all right? But they've been given a lot of money anyway.
Yeah.
But where's that money going? Well, we don't know because no one has given it any oversight.
Right.
Now, that's a classical blackmail scheme, okay?
Yes. Yes.
That's what indicates to me that someone else is holding the gun to the Anglo-American elite's head. I don't think that they're the final... and again, please understand me here. I have absolutely no evidence to this. This is merely a gut feeling of the way that these operations within operations have worked in the past. Okay?
Yes.
It fits a pattern. And if this pattern is the same thing, note the word if, then it means that these corporations are not the final beneficiaries of all of this financial largesse. Mm-hmm. Some of it may indeed be people like Rockefeller or Rothschild, but I don't think so. I think someone else is in play. Definitely. We have, again, to take another example from recent history, and I've mentioned this in a previous session, but I will recall it in this context again. We had that whole Baghdad museum looting thing.
Right.
Which to me is not a minor blip in this story. It's a major one. Because the American military was accused of having perpetrated the crime when it was initially reported. American soldiers were said to be seen going in and out of the museum and removing stuff.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And when we did send in a Marine colonel, Colonel Bogdanos, to investigate the thefts and recover some of this stuff, he did a very good job, and he quickly came to the conclusion that it was an inside job. But he also came to the conclusion that it was nothing but a kind of antiquities smugglers that were after all of this stuff. I don't think so.
Yeah.
Because let's look at the other heavy on-the-ground presence inside of Iraq prior to the invasion. The intelligence service, besides Saddam Hussein's, that had the heaviest presence in Iraq was the German Bundesnachrichtendienst. Okay?
That's a mouthful.
Yes, it is, but it's basically their version of the CIA or the KGB or the Mossad, what have you.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that had this heavy on-the-ground presence. And if you think that they're clumsy or doltish, think again. You know, they have this wonderful little commando unit called the GSG-9, and they're really good. I mentioned they were even probably deployed to this country in the aftermath of Oklahoma City. But anyway, it was the German media that first broke that story. and broke it in the way that fingered American soldiers as the ones behind the looting. So I think if any nation is likely to have been on the inside job there, it wasn't us at all. It was probably either France or Germany.
Wow.
Because after all, those two nations were the ones helping Saddam with their archaeological teams dig up all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Those two nations are the ones that had the catalogs of what they were finding.
Yeah.
Those two nations were the ones that would have known exactly where it was located. So again, to me, this is a little indicator that you have some very quiet, behind-the-scenes, covert jockeying for power and control of these types of things going on between what I would call a kind of a European faction and a kind of an Anglo-American faction, and poor Great Britain is now caught somewhere uneasily between the two. Because, you know, they've got this so-called special relationship with us on the one hand, and yet they're members of the European Union on the other. So, to me, this is a clear indicator that the Anglo-American part of it is in some serious trouble. Someone's not playing by their rules anymore. Is this all making sense?
Extremely. Yes, it does. It does make sense, Joe.
Now, again, I want to stress something here for your listeners. When I point out these stories, these things that I'm connecting in a particular way, I am certainly not advocating that they are the only way that they can be connected. I am merely using them as illustrations of my opinion about what I think may be going on. And that opinion could be totally wrong. Let's admit it. Because when you're dealing with this kind of stuff, you can never really deal with evidence. You have to kind of construct a case and argue a case rather than, I was a conspirator and I was involved in with this and that and the other plot, and here are the documents to prove it. So please don't get me wrong here. I'm not proposing any of this as a hard and fast fact. I am proposing it as my interpretation, and those are my intuitions about what I think is going on, and in support of those intuitions, I mention these stories.
Yes,
okay?
Yes. Well, it's very insightful. The things, the dots that you have connected. Oh my goodness! Wow. Well, if this grand extortion, how can this end up? I mean, do you see some different scenarios concerning that?
Well, as far as the power elite is concerned, the scenario is going to end up with a global corporate state. Okay? And when we say that, we can say feudalism. That's where they want it to go.
Yeah.
I just don't see it happening. And we can thump passages from Revelation or this or that interpretation of eschatology, but my point is not really even made on the basis of any of that.
Yeah.
My point is that human nature being what it is, and predators being what they are,
yeah,
that at some point one faction is going to go after another as they get closer to the goal. And as they get closer, that factional infighting only increases. So as it increases, the goal recedes. Okay? Now let's look back at history as an example of it. Just prior to World War II, the Anglo-American banking elite was in the full flush of its ability to manipulate things for its own purposes. After all, that group of people had installed the communists. They had installed the Nazis. They had installed Roosevelt. Okay?
Yeah.
They had 3 different versions of socialism that they were all hoping to play. Okay? However, 2 of those people weren't playing quite by the rules. namely Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler. You see? So their ability to, they want to manipulate things, but when they pick these extremely devious, cunning, clever, ingenious people to be their point men, when they do that, they're only cutting their own throat, because those kind of people are not going to sit by and simply take orders.
Exactly.
You see?
Yeah.
So the game always goes on. It just always goes on. And the closer they get to their goals, the more they recede. It's like, the Zeno's paradox in a certain sort of way.
Yeah. Oh, Joseph. Well, okay. Here's another question. I think, I'm not absolutely positive, but I think that the Vatican Bank has a branch office, if you will, in Panama.
In Panama? Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I think so. And that, it would be interesting, oh boy, with so many of those people, the rat line from the Vatican to South America. God only knows what's going on, financially, and the clout. And then you notice lately, I think it was in the last 2 months, Joseph, that they forced the government, this global security, homeland security, whatever the heck they call themselves, went over to Switzerland, and this article said they were forced to open and give over the records of the depositors. And then I think they went to Liechtenstein, but I don't know if they were successful in getting those records. But how can they do that? Go into a foreign country and force those banks to turn over their depositors list? Well,
very simply. You have to have leverage of some sort.
Yeah.
Okay. You have to have something that if the Swiss demur, that you can say, okay, well, if you don't do this, we'll do this.
Right.
Okay. There has to be something of that nature implied. So I don't know what it would be in the case of the Swiss. I do know that they have modified their banking laws to a certain extent over there.
Yeah.
But there are certainly other havens, banking havens around the world that have laws very similar to what the Swiss used to be. Okay, you mentioned Liechtenstein, and that's certainly one of them. Even here in South Dakota, the banking laws are a bit peculiar.
Yeah.
So, you have the Grand Caymans, Singapore, and so on and so forth, and a couple of kind of free zones in communist China. So, you would have to have some sort of leverage of that nature. And that little article, I'm not familiar with it, but again, that's a little indicator to me that there's some infighting going on.
Oh, yeah.
Between the Anglo-American wing of things of this New World Order and the European wing of things, okay?
Right.
And it looks increasingly to me like the Europeans, at least as far as the financial wheeling dealings go, in spite of the fact that some of the countries in Europe are just under dire straits, peculiarly, the Europeans don't seem to be nearly as panicked about it as we do.
Yeah.
Okay? Which I find horribly strange. Okay? China and Russia and India are the countries, as far as I'm concerned, are going to be the ones to watch in the next 5 or so years, how they deal with this situation. My guess is going to be they're going to become increasingly independent of their would-be Anglo-American masters. And as testament of that fact, what does Putin do? Well, he says to Hugo Chavez, we'll protect you, give us a naval base.
Yeah.
Well, whoops. And you'll notice nary a peep out of Washington.
Yeah.
Now, back in the bad old days of the Cold War, that would have called forth from the likes of a John Kennedy a blockade.
Oh, sure.
At the minimum, And this man was a liberal Democrat, okay? But what do we have in office now? We've got a so-called conservative Republican. and nary a peep.
Right.
Now, to me, this means, number one, that militarily we're overextended. We can do absolutely nothing whatsoever to counter any moves on an overt nature that Russia makes. Now, what we may be doing covertly is another matter. But certainly we can't afford a direct face-to-face confrontation. And Putin as much showed us that when he put down that little Zbigniew-Brzezinski plan in Georgia and South Ossetia.
Yeah.
Okay? That was, I guarantee you, that was a direct challenge. Stop us if you think you can.
Yeah.
And of course, we hemmed and hawed and wrote nasty articles, and Condoleezza Rice was flown over there, poodle that she is, like she's going to take out anything that the Russian bear has to say.
Yeah, it's an insult.
It's an insult. Yeah, it's an insult to the Russians, that any of this is going to make the slightest bit of difference to Mr. Putin's agenda. So again, we have all of these little indicators that this grand new world order scheme is showing distinctive signs of some very major roadblocks. They may be successful in pulling off a part of it in a part of the world, but I don't think they're going to be successful in having their way unilaterally with Russia, with some of Latin America.
Yeah.
And Chavez, let's look at what Chavez is. In my take, I don't think this man is quite the socialist that our elite makes him out to be. Okay? What he really is a Latin American nationalist.
Yeah.
Okay? He's a nationalist like Torrijos was back in Panama. Okay? He is, even to a certain extent, like Noriega was in Panama.
Yeah.
The thing that this global elite cannot stand is anyone standing up to them.
Yes.
That's what Chavez has done. And to his credit, unlike Torrijos and Noriega, he has a very powerful backer named Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Who's put Russian ships there just to make sure. Okay?
Yeah.
So in other words, that's Mr. Putin sending a little message to Mr. Rockefeller and to Mr. Rothschild that things are not going to go all your way.
Yeah. And that's a good thing, I think.
And that's a good thing, yes. Because, if unchecked, this American empire that they're trying to build, if unchecked, it would lead us down the very same path that all other empires in history have gone.
Oh, God, yes.
Dictatorship, violence, and eventually dissolution.
Well, when you look at dictatorship, I mean, military law is like, it's a dictatorship.
Yes. Yeah.
And they keep threatening, you keep hearing on the internet, any minute, boy, they're going to declare martial law. I don't know, without using foreign troops, Joseph, I don't think that they could do that.
Well, that's the point. We're overextended as it is.
Yeah.
And if you want a really out-of-control, chaotic situation, all you have to do is call in Chinese troops or Russian troops or German troops or French troops or anybody's troops, but basically they're the only ones that have troops to call in that would have any sort of any sort of training to deal with the situation. You're not going to be calling in Portuguese troops or things of this nature because they just don't have that many to call in.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with China or Russia or Germany or France, they have fairly sizable military establishments that are very competent, so they're basically the only ones you could rely on.
Yeah.
And just imagine how that's going to sit with the American populace. It ain't going to sit too well.
Right.
And I don't think that those countries would be inclined to do it either. Because, as far as Germany is concerned, their military is more or less a European thing. They've certainly got their troops in Afghanistan with us, and to a lesser extent in Iraq. But as far as the majority of their military commitment, that's a European thing, and the Russians are more or less the same way.
Yeah.
The Chinese, depending on what general is in power or has the most sway at the moment, they might be inclined to do it, but if they did, they'd be getting in way over their heads. So no, I don't see it either. I think it's a situation tailor-made for disaster if they go that route, because once you roll the war dice.
Oh yeah.
You've taken a big risk because things can spiral out of control so quickly.
You bet.
It's just, I don't see them doing it. Maybe so. Maybe others have information I'm not privy to. I just don't see it happening.
You had mentioned something earlier about, I think it was the Nazis and Oklahoma City. Yeah.
What's the connection between Elohim City and Oklahoma City? Well, just to kind of update your listeners.
Okay.
There was a commune just outside of Roland and Muldrow, Oklahoma, which is up there on I-40, just over the border from Fort Smith, Arkansas. This commune was run by a so-called Christian evangelical pastor, yet another version of the American Bible and Bible-only religion, that was basically a white supremacist Aryan Christian group, okay? And this compound had an interesting personage attached to it by the name of Andreas Strassmeyer. Oh. Strassmeyer was the head of security for this compound, and he was the one that instructed them in how to handle automatic arms and build bunkers and deal with, highbrow military explosives and so on and so forth. Well, Strassmeyer, if you go back to the period of the Oklahoma City bombing, there was a British reporter in Washington, D.C., assigned there by the London Times, by the name of Ambrose Evans Pritchard.
Yes.
And he was one of these people that picked up on a story that had actually been broken by some investigative reporters, one of whom was a fellow by the name of J.D. Cash, right there in Oklahoma, that was working for the McGurton Gazette. And then his research eventually kind of spurred a then overnight talk show host by the name of Chuck Harder, who had his own kind of syndicated radio network that was covering the Oklahoma City bombing and actually had done quite a deal of its own investigation into the matter. Well, this is a whole can of worms, Georgianne, because at the time I was working in radio at one of Harder's affiliates.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah. I was an on-air personality. I was a board op, and I was the guy that changed the satellite feeds at the appropriate times and did the weather and did the news and occasionally did a little show. Well, anyway, Harder was one of the few, in fact, I would say probably the only media outlet in this country, besides Ambrose Evans Pritchard for the London Times, that smelled something terribly wrong with the Oklahoma City bombing story and began to cover it and talk about it on the air. Now, before we get to the German connection, let me tell you what happened to Harder. Within a matter of a few weeks after he began running these stories, Harder was approached by someone who basically, in my opinion, conned him into going for a scheme that would manufacture electronic components and so on and so forth and bring manufacturing jobs back to this country, because Harder was also a big opponent of NAFTA and GATT and all of this, Rockefeller nonsense, that we're all going to prosper by shipping our jobs overseas. Well, as a result of this scam, basically Harder's network was shut down. Now, he's since reemerged. He's back on the air on shortwave and I think to a lesser extent on Internet, but nothing like he was back then, because he was on lots of these little ma and pa radio stations all over the country.
Right. They'd rebroadcast him.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was at one of these stations. Well, what happened to his network was very peculiar. It was almost as if marching orders went out all over the country to go in and buy up all these little ma and pa stations.
Oh, gee.
Yeah, mine was one of them.
Oh, my goodness.
We were hit with a couple of yahoos from Oklahoma there that came up into Kansas, bought this radio station, and then proceeded to fire the engineer.
Huh.
Now, at that time, under FCC regulations, you had to have an engineer on staff.
Yeah.
Okay? And the other thing they did was they started throwing out station logs.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and that's another big no-no. If the FCC shows up and you're the one on the air, you get the fine.
Yes.
So, I wasn't about to go for that, so I quit the job. And a bunch of the people there, well, it was almost a complete 100% changeover of personnel at this station within a matter of days of these new owners showing up, and the station deteriorated so quickly. The old owner bought it back. Okay, but the effect was Harder was taken off the air, and his alternative coverage of Oklahoma City bombing was removed. Okay, so that left Ambrose Evans Pritchard. Okay, and Pritchard picked up on a story that Harder broke through this J.D. Cash and some other people that he had hired to go in and investigate this story. And that brings us back to Elohim City and this German character by the name of Andreas Strassmeyer. Strassmeyer at the time was in his late 20s, about 28, 29, I think, and had been seen at a strip bar in Tulsa, Oklahoma called Lady Godiva's. It's there on Sheridan Avenue. And, I used to drive by that thing all the time. Sheridan is one of the major north-south avenues in Tulsa. And Strassmeyer had been seen in the company of Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols at this bar.
Yeah.
So, anyway, what happens is Strassmeyer is bopping down the interstate, I-40 there, just west of Fort Smith, and he's pulled over by the local Oklahoma Highway Patrol for driving without tags, car tags.
Yeah.
And Strassmeyer is hauled off to jail, and his attaché case, which he claims is full of papers, is hauled off to jail. When he's in jail, the local deputy there, I think it was either Roland or Muldrow, I forget which city, gets a call from Governor Keating.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Governor Keating says, you got to release this guy immediately. He's got diplomatic immunity.
Don't you?
And if that isn't enough, this deputy starts getting calls from Fort Bragg, from the Pentagon, from high brass military officers, I think everything from a major up to a lieutenant general, saying you got to let this guy go, and you got to let him go now.
Yeah.
So they do, and Strassmeyer is let go, and then he sort of disappears right about the time that the FBI uncovers the fact that he was an associate of some sort of McVeigh and Nichols. Okay? So they start putting out the be on the lookout for this guy because he's a person of interest. Well, they scour the country for this guy, and nobody can find him. He turns up in Berlin. He gives a press conference in Berlin at his family home.
Yeah.
Okay? Says, no, I'm right here. I'm fine. And then he disappears from history. Now, after this happens, Ambrose Evans Pritchard and some of these other investigators discovered the fact that apparently he was smuggled out of this country by the German GS-G9.
Oh, my goodness.
Which is their elite commando unit of the Bundesgrenzpolizei, German border police.
Yeah.
Which was a unit that they had started after the Munich Olympics massacre of all those Israeli athletes. Okay? They decided they needed a really elite commando team to handle situations like that. So in other words, the story is that Germany deployed a commando unit to this country to get out a German national named Andreas Strassmeyer, who was working for a white Christian Aryan supremacist group in Oklahoma, who was a close associate of Timothy McVeigh. Okay?
Oh, my goodness.
So, and your listeners may know who, from listening to previous sessions, who Andreas Strassmayer really was. Well, he was a graduate of the German Hanover War Academy, Germany's West Point.
Yeah.
He was a former lieutenant in Germany's Panzer Grenadiers in the German Army, okay, which is, armored infantry, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So he was a German military officer. His father, Günther Strassmayer, was chairman of the Christian Democratic Union political party in Berlin and a senior minister in Chancellor Kohl's government, and basically Chancellor Kohl's right-hand man for handling German reunification.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, boy.
So in other words, as all of this is going down, as Germany's just being reunified, well, we have the son of the minister responsible over here in this country running security and intelligence for a white Christian supremacist group. Now, there's any number of takes, because he may have been an intelligence asset on loan to this country from Germany, specifically for the purpose of penetrating some of these organizations and keeping tabs on them, because they were certainly of interest to Clinton's FBI. Okay, but by the same token, he may have been genuinely part of these groups and playing, in classic Nazi International style, playing both ends against the middle.
Yeah.
Because if you look at what I write about German reunification in the Nazi International, the whole process, at least on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, is being driven by a bunch of neo-Nazis.
Yes.
And they're getting enormous amounts of money from somewhere, and part of that money is coming directly from Chancellor Kohl's government in Bonn.
Oh, my
gosh. Exactly what's going on here. And if you look at German foreign policy moves after the reunification, it's kind of interesting. You get the German defense minister and the German foreign minister after the reunification, and I cite this in the book, saying things like, oh, well, good, now the gloves are off again. So let's go break up Czechoslovakia, which they did.
Yes.
Let's break up Yugoslavia, which they did. And all of this was done over the protestations of Washington and London. And it was, if we didn't have enough clout with them at that time to stop them from doing this,
right?
Imagine how much clout we have with them now.
Oh, boy.
You watch the Discovery Channel. I saw this about 8 weeks ago, Georgianne. I just have to mention this. I sent you that YouTube video of the German Army doing this drill show in a stadium in Cologne, right? Remember that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, on the Discovery Channel, about 8 weeks ago, they have this show on occasionally that goes into military hardware and all this stuff. It's kind of a military pornography show, and.
Oh, my.
And they had this guy travel to Germany, where he said he was in search of the world's most sophisticated artillery system, and they devoted eight whole minutes of this program to showing you the self-propelled artillery system of the modern German army. And you got to watch this to really believe it, because it really is a sophisticated piece of machinery when you get right down to it. And justifiably, I think they probably are correct in claiming it's the most advanced artillery system in the world. The loading is all automatic, and it can put, one barrel can put 5 rounds out in 60 seconds, and all have them arrive at the same time.
Oh, my gosh.
So you can imagine what a battery of these things does to a target. And within 15 seconds, the barrel can be locked into position, and they can, be off and running again, shoot and scoot. And they interview this German general that's in charge of the school teaching the soldiers how to run this contraption. And that's basically what he says, it's shoot and scoot. So I just illustrate that as a little kind of aside that, we have all of this technology, military technology in this country that everyone thinks is grand and good and glorious and wonderful. Well, yeah, maybe so. But my point is, other countries have a lot of technology too.
Yeah.
You know, Russia has certainly never stopped investigating and devoting enormous amounts of research into sophisticated weapons systems. Forget about the collapse of communism doing anything to that. It didn't stop at all. And under Putin, you can just bet your bottom dollar it's continued at a breakneck speed.
Sure.
So, you know, I cite all this again just as little indicators that not everything is going smoothly for the Anglo-American elite. There are other players in the field now.
Well, that's a good thing.
That's maybe a good thing.
Maybe.
If some of the players, Georgianne, are Nazis, it's probably not a good thing.
Yeah, if they're Nazis, no, it's not a good thing. Nazis, communists, fascists,
right.
Not good thing.
No, no.
Oh, my God. You know, speaking of Nazis, communists, all of that.
Nazis, communists, fascists, oh my.
Yeah. You know, Joseph, who did and who does the Vatican? I mean, how do they play into the back door of this? Because they're into it up to their little funny fish hat.
Oh boy. Well, this aspect of this conspiracy story is the least appreciated.
Oh, yeah.
And I haven't even written a book about it yet. The whole ecclesiastical angle.
Yeah.
And to set up my answer, I've got to do some background. If you look at what is happening within the major churches of Christendom in the last, say 70 years or so.
Yeah.
If you look at the Methodists, if you look at the Lutherans, if you look at the Presbyterians, the Roman Catholics, and so on and so forth, you will see in each church that there have been sweeping changes in their liturgies, in their confessional statements, in the kind of clergy that they're training. You know, it used to be the case that just to be a Methodist minister, you had to have horrendous amounts of education.
Yeah.
It's really to the point that if you also look at, you know, the classic case to me is the Episcopal Church. You know, because their change in the last 70 or so years has been probably the most dramatic next to the Roman Catholics, because their very traditional liturgy has been so uglified and modernized and so on. But my point is if you look at all of these churches, you'll also notice something else. Each one of them, every last one of them, has some sort of traditionalist movement of resistance, either within them or, as in the case of the Episcopalians, some just actually broke away, okay, and continued doing things the good old way, basically. And certainly, you know, if you recall Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre that kept the Latin Mass and his own group going for so long after Vatican II, you see a similar phenomenon in the Roman Catholic Church, okay? And those people, incidentally, are still around, those traditional Latin Rite Catholics. Well, all of this is going on and coordinated, and that's the key here. It's being coordinated from a variety of sources and mechanisms. Certainly one aspect of this story, and it's one that most people don't know, and I can't even really get into it here without a book to back me up, and at some point I intend on writing it, although I do mention it in great length in that book that I told you about, the electronic book, God, History, and Dialectic. I devote a whole chapter, actually 2 whole chapters, to this phenomenon. The very final chapter, which is called The Pattern of Apostasy, which I go into the techniques that these groups use to subvert churches, and then a previous chapter where I discuss the role that biblical criticism has played in undermining traditional confessional churches within Christendom. Okay, and the techniques themselves do not vary Okay? They are applied across the board. So in other words, what I'm telling you now is that the leadership of the mainline churches has been co-opted, number one. Okay? Number two, the phenomenon with which Christians are dealing, and please understand me, I am not talking about evangelical American civil religion. I'm not talking about Baptists, and when I say Baptist, I mean those who do not accept infant baptism. I don't mean the denomination, I mean the theological position. Okay? When I'm talking about mainline Christianity, I'm talking about everybody but them. Okay? Because they're kind of a unique phenomenon all to themselves that have to be dealt with rather differently. But when you deal with mainline Christianity, what you're dealing with now is a phenomenon that is now transconfessional in nature. It is now, so to speak, an across-the-board apostasy. Are you with me so far?
Oh, yes.
Now, please understand how I'm defining apostasy. I'm defining it as the deliberate abandonment of a previously accepted traditional, liturgical, and confessional tradition. Okay? In other words, the hallmarks of it are going to be the abandonment of traditional ways of worship. We saw that in the Roman Catholic Church at Vatican II, when they completely overhauled the Mass.
Right.
Okay? And when I say overhauled, I don't mean they just translated it from Latin to English. They rewrote it.
Yeah.
Okay? And in my opinion, you can find very little of traditional Roman Catholic doctrine in the new one. Okay? There was even a cardinal by the name of Alfredo Cardinal Ottaviani that wrote up a series of formal objections to the new Mass and presented them to Paul VI. Okay? And Paul VI had already found out about, had already promulgated the new Mass, and then subsequently found out that the chief bishop in charge of drawing the new Mass up was a Freemason.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay?
Yeah.
So, you know, since you're infallible, you can't admit a mistake, at least according to Roman Catholic teaching. So Paul VI sent this archbishop off to be apostolic nuncio to Iran. That was kind of like exile, because there's not a lot of Roman Catholics in Iran.
Right.
So anyway, this is what I'm talking about, this transconfessional apostasy. And the only reason I'm picking on the Roman Catholic Church here, or focusing my attention on it rather, is because that's the nature of your question. Is the Vatican involved in all of this? Well, the answer is yes. And it's a very simple reason why. If you put yourself now in the thinking of the New World's Anglo-American corporate elite crowd, if you examine the position papers and so on that they have published from time to time, you will get the distinct impression that they realize that one of the most cohesive forces in a culture or in a political order is precisely religion.
Oh, yeah.
And to have a global corporate New World Order, you're going to have a global corporate religion, and you're going to have something with global extent. And there are really only three, but better put, two real contenders for that position. Number one is Roman Catholicism, and number two is Islam.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? To a much lesser extent, Eastern Orthodoxy. But the problem there is it's mostly confined to the Middle East and Eastern Europe and Russia. It does have a presence globally, certainly, but not nearly to the extent that Roman Catholicism has.
Right.
So, those are the two major contenders. Now, you're just never going to get Islam to play along with your global corporate New World Order scheme, since you're the ones that have been raping Muslim countries for so many years of their natural resources. And to really thumb their nose at the Islamic world, they maneuvered and installed this Zionist state in Palestine.
Yeah.
Okay? So you're not going to get much cooperation from them. That leaves Roman Catholicism. Now, the key there is that, number one, it's so much a part of the fabric of the history and culture of the West that you simply cannot ignore it, number one. Number two, it has specifically stated claims on its role in that history and culture. Now, as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, I myself believe those claims to be utterly spurious. But nonetheless, they're there, and there are people who believe them. Okay, that's the reality. Okay? So, perforce, if you're a New World Order global conspirator, you're going to have to target the Roman Catholic Church, and more particularly, you are going to have to target not only the papacy, but the actual governing mechanism of the Roman Church, which is the College of Cardinals.
Right.
Okay? And if you go back now to, just to bring it to a current or perhaps contemporary well-known figure that was saying things like this for many years would be Father Malachi Martin.
That's right.
Okay? Now, Father Malachi was... I had the privilege of corresponding with him for about 3 years, just before the end of his life. And I've never shared that correspondence with anybody, with the exception of one person. But I can tell you that he was a very shrewd, very perceptive man.
Oh, yes.
As to what was happening not only in his own church, but in others. Okay? Now, he wrote a novel that I would recommend that your listeners get and read very carefully. The novel is called Vatican. Yeah. All right? It gives a definitely Roman Catholic take on events within the Roman Church during and after World War II up to the present time.
Okay.
All right? I can tell you this. If you know the details of modern Roman Church history in that time period, every one of the major characters in that novel, with the exception of two, are specifically identifiable.
Whoa.
Which makes the revelations that the novel contains extremely interesting. One of them is, and I'm only skimming the surface here, one of them is that at a point of history in the Roman Church, a bargain was struck, and that's what Malachi calls it in the novel, is the bargain. Mm-hmm. A bargain was struck between the papacy and the global corporate banking elite. All right?
Yeah.
And I can also tell you, when I was corresponding with Father Malachi, one of the things I specifically asked him was, I know of certain documents and things from the Grand Orient Lodges in Europe from the 19th century that were said in specific reference to the papacy. Mm-hmm. And I asked him if he knew about these things and if he suspected that the whole history and development of the papacy, including Vatican I, was somehow involved in this conspiracy.
Yes.
Okay? Now, I can't tell you what he said. I can't even really intimate what the contents of his response were.
Right.
I can tell you that what he writes in his books, and particularly in that novel, are definitely a part of this plan. So, in other words, in his publicly written statements, what he's telling you is that yes, the Roman Church is co-opted. There are those of us who know it and who are fighting that on the inside.
Yes.
I can tell you that at one point, Pope Paul VI was involved in some of these plots and later changed his mind. Okay? So, it's a whole can of worms there, the ecclesiastical angle to this story. It's probably the biggest angle, and I'm sorry if you're an evangelical or from the Baptist tradition, you're not going to understand it because you're antithetical to that whole tradition anyway.
That's right.
Okay? You simply are not going to be in a position to get the nuances of it by dint of your own theological position. So to understand the story and to tell it is going to require someone, from within one of those mainline Christian traditions, like a Father Malachi Martin. But rest assured, Georgianne, you can go to any of the major denominations, dig and scratch and sniff long enough, and you're going to find similar people, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Methodist, Anglican, even Eastern Orthodox versions of Father Malachi Martin. And they will be telling you exactly the same story.
Wow. That's awesome.
It's truly awesome.
Well, Joseph, we look at Croatia and the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And the Ustashia.
And the Ustashi? Oh,
yeah.
boy. Mm-hmm.
Oh, tell us about that.
All right. Well, let me light my cigarette here.
Yeah.
Because this is another part of the story that's a very nasty part.
Yeah, I know.
During World War II, after the Nazis invaded Yugoslavia and Greece in May of 1941, after they, of course, Yugoslavia and Greece didn't have a chance, they were quickly and easily crushed. The Nazis broke up Yugoslavia.
Yes. And
installed basically a puppet government, a breakaway government in Croatia that was under the Ustashi regime, which was the political party, the kind of Croatian version of Nazism.
Yeah.
The fellow that ran that state was called the Poglavnik, which was Croatian for Führer. Okay?
Yes.
So you had basically a Nazi puppet regime based in Zagreb, the city of Zagreb, Yugoslavia, that was part of this independent Croatia. Now, the reason the breakup occurred was that Croatia, if you look at Yugoslavia, Yugoslavia was one of those bizarre creations of the Versailles Treaty. We're going to stitch together a nation out of very different ethnic groups and religious cultures. Well, Yugoslavia, was mostly Serbian, which was Eastern Orthodox, but then you had the Croatians, which were Roman Catholic, and then the Bosnians, which were Muslim. Okay? Mm-hmm. So you had this polyglot country created out of Versailles, which is just trouble to begin with.
Sure.
All right? The Roman Catholic population in Croatia and the Eastern Orthodox population in Serbia had been for centuries at loggerheads, all right? For centuries. The Nazis installed a puppet government there called the Ustashi government, and one of the Roman Catholic hierarchs there that was very tight with the Croatian Ustashi regime was a fellow by the name of Bishop Alois Hudal, Hudal. Okay? Mm-hmm. You can actually find pictures of him, if you look long enough, standing next to some of the Croatian leaders giving the Nazi salute. Okay? Well, this regime was so barbaric in its persecution of Jews and Serbian Eastern Orthodox that even the Nazis found it appalling. Okay?
That's pretty good.
That's pretty good if you're topping Himmler, So the Nazis basically told the leader of the Croatian government, tone it down. Yeah. Get rid of these people that are going around beheading and amputating and doing all the grisly things that they're doing to Jews and Eastern Orthodox, okay? Right. And I want to be very clear. This is being done to Eastern Orthodox as well as Jews. Sure. And, Muslims, the few that were up there, didn't have a prayer, So the reason, of course, that the Nazis told the Croatians to tone it down wasn't because they had a sudden change of heart. It was really because their two allies that were going to be coming up, in the campaign in Russia were Romania and Bulgaria, which were Eastern Orthodox countries. So, you don't want to offend your allies.
Yeah.
So that was largely the reason that they told them to tone it down. But the regime, nevertheless, was just absolutely barbaric and brutal throughout the entire war. After they were told to kind of tone it down with the Eastern Orthodox, well, the onus of their anger fell on the Jews. So, it was still just barbaric beyond all belief. Well, the reason that the Ustashi regime is important from the standpoint of the Nazi International is that when the rat lines began to be set up by the Vatican to help these people out of Europe and into Latin America, the Ustashi regime was sort of the trial run, okay? And like all fascist regimes that had plundered the people, and the leader of this regime had turned over a lot of the money and put them in the Vatican banks to get it out of Europe. To get it out of Europe.
Yeah.
Well, if you dig into the history of the rat lines, one of the people that is instrumental in getting Vatican diplomatic passports to the members of the Ustashi regime to get them out of Europe was this Bishop Alois Hudal. Okay? Now, this is a very significant thing because the other person that is involved in providing, there are actually two other people involved in providing Vatican diplomatic passports to these people. One is Archbishop Giuseppe Siri of Genoa, Italy, who later becomes Cardinal Siri. Now, this is an interesting man because there is a certain segment of these Catholic traditionalists that I mentioned earlier that maintain that at the papal conclave following the death of Pope John the 23rd, during the Second Vatican Council, that it was actually Cardinal Siri that was elected Pope, not Giovanni Montini that became Paul VI. Okay? So there's an aspect of this story that goes down to contemporary times as late as Vatican II and the papal conclave that elects Paul VI. All right? The other player in the Vatican rat lines for all these fascists getting out of Europe is precisely Giovanni Cardinal Montini, who is Archbishop of Milan. All right? But he's also a major player in the Vatican Secretariat of State during the war. And this is the man, incidentally, that went on to be elected Pope Paul VI. Okay? So you have, as late as 1963, some of these players involved in the Vatican rat lines, and two of them are major candidates for the papal election. So in other words, again, you have an indicator that there are forces and powers moving behind the scenes, jockeying for position and control of a major institution. I happen to believe, like Father Malachi, that one of those factions that was involved in trying to steer the Roman Church in a particular direction, particularly during the Second Vatican Council, was precisely this rather obscure alliance between this banking corporate elite on the one hand and the esoteric or occult faction represented by the Grand Orients in Europe on the other.
Yeah.
But hidden behind that, you see, there's this rat line story.
Yes.
And Nazis. So there is a possible third player on the scene. And to me, again, this is just a point of interest. I am not claiming anything about it other than that it is interesting that the first two non-Italian popes that were elected after Paul VI's death, and then, of course, you had that short pontificate of John Paul I, who was Albino Cardinal Luciani from Venice.
Yeah.
You had the election of Karl Cardinal Wojtyla as John Paul II from Poland, and then his successor was his so-called doctrinal hitman, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, from Germany.
What a name, Rect.
Yeah, what a name. Exactly. Now, let me tell you something about Cardinal Ratzinger, a.k.a. Pope Benedict XVI.
Right.
During the Second Vatican Council, Cardinal Ratzinger was then, of course, a priest, Father Joseph Ratzinger. And he was one of what were called the periti, which is a Latin term for expert. When the bishops and cardinals came to the Second Vatican Council, they each brought with them their kind of theological experts, okay? Because you have to understand a Roman Catholic bishop is largely an administrator and a pastor rather than a theologian. So they bring with them their theological experts that kind of are working behind the scenes to influence the council in a particular way.
Right.
Well, Joseph Ratzinger is one of these theological experts that is brought by, I think it was Cardinal Koenig of Vienna, to the Vatican Council. And it was Ratzinger who became part of what is called the Rhine Group. You can study the history of the Vatican Council and learn of this group. Okay? Basically, what this group did was it had a plan ready to go when John the 23rd announced the council. They came up with a plan essentially to hijack the council during its first session, okay, and install a substitute agenda. So in other words, if you read the history of the council, you have the Curia in Rome preparing one set of topics and points they want covered in the council. And then you have another group led by these so-called periti, these experts that would have been classified as liberals, okay, theological liberals. And what they want to do is completely overhaul the Roman Church, okay? And Ratzinger is a member of that group.
Oh, my goodness, Joe.
See what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay? So when you read Father Malachi, you have to understand something. If any of your readers do read him, Father Malachi was given a dispensation by Paul VI after the end of the Second Vatican Council because, like many Roman priests, he was one of those who just had a crisis of conscience and could not, under his conscience, celebrate the new Mass with good conscience.
Right.
Okay?
I don't blame him.
In other words, he had serious doctrinal reservations about it.
Right.
So he was given a dispensation to celebrate the old Latin Mass privately. Okay? So you may hear rumors from time to time that Father Malachi was laicized and so on and so forth. No, that's not true. He was always a priest. He was just removed from public service, but he was granted the right to continue his spiritual life privately, so to speak, okay?
Right.
Now, this is something that I think I should stress here.
Okay.
Since you've asked about the Roman Church. When you were a priest ready to be ordained prior to Vatican II, you took an oath at your ordination called the Oath Against Modernism. Okay, it was drawn up, I believe, by or during the time period or pontificate of Pius V. I may be wrong on that. A Roman Catholic scholar would probably be able to tell you better. But in any case, there was this oath. And it was drawn up after the Council of Trent back during the Catholic Counter-Reformation in the 17th century, okay? And at the Council of Trent, of course, they sort of codified the text of the Latin Mass that became the standard for the next 300 years. Well, one of the oaths that you took was that you would, under pain of automatic excommunication, celebrate this Mass and no other. Okay?
Yeah.
So you can see the moral dilemma that Vatican II put some traditionally minded Roman Catholic priests in.
Yeah.
Because by coming up with an entirely new text of the Mass, which one of your own cardinals has doctrinally objected to, okay?
Yes.
If you come up with that, then it does put your morally conscious Roman priest in a dilemma.
Sure. Particularly
ones ordained under the old Mass. You know, I know several Roman priests that later joined the Orthodox Church that have told me that this was one of their principal problems in the aftermath of Vatican II. It was as if the Roman Catholic Church had suddenly and completely renounced 1,900 years of its own church tradition. You know, and it's a serious problem. And this is the perspective out of which Malachi Martin writes. He's that kind of priest, caught in a church, gone nuts. Okay, and this is the story he's trying to tell.
Yes.
As to how we got here, who's behind it, what's going on. And as I say, you can repeat his story in each and every main denomination within Western Christianity.
Okay, question.
Sure.
With this change,
Mm-hmm.
could this, or was this not widely known maybe, but could this have been a preparatory step to bring to the forefront the Muslim faith?
No, I don't think in that quite that direct sense.
Okay.
However, you do find after Vatican II levels of Roman Catholic involvement within very bizarre ecumenical gatherings that a Pope Pius XII or people prior to Vatican II would just never have countenanced, ever.
Yeah.
Okay, it just would not have happened. And some of that, in some of these ecumenical congresses that they have sponsored, have just been very bizarre events. John Paul II sponsored one at Assisi in Italy in the 80s, I think it was. That was just a bizarre event. But no, I don't think it is to Muslimize Roman Catholicism in that sense.
Well, no, not that way. What, why do we have a Pope kissing the Quran?
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of strange stuff going on, Joe.
Well, yeah, there is, and stuff like that is designed to send signals.
Oh,
okay?
yes, definitely.
And again, I point you and your listeners to the last chapter of that ebook because I go into why these types of symbolic acts are being done. Okay, it is in part, it is done deliberately to create psychological and spiritual disorientation in their own flock.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because it's certainly not going to impress an imam, that the Pope is kissing the Quran.
Right.
All it's going to signal to them is you people are weak, and you think that you're going to negotiate us out of our faith. Mm-hmm. That's not going to happen. The whole ecumenical mentality, let's put it that way, is if you are a serious ecumenist, you do not believe in any revealed truth. Okay? Everything is negotiable. But what you cannot stand and what you cannot figure out is how to deal with those who do believe in that.
Yes.
Okay? Because none of your techniques will work, because the people who do believe in that will be able to see those techniques for what they are. It's the people on the fence that those techniques are directed at, and particularly churches like the Roman Church or the Episcopal Church or the Orthodox Church, where you have an institutional claim to be descended from apostolic authority and to be perpetuating it. Okay, when you have that kind of church, the position it puts the person in the pew in is the sad and tragic choice between having to go into schism from an institution that makes those claims in order to preserve your faith, or foregoing the preservation of all aspects of your faith while remaining loyal to the institution and its claims. You see?
Yes.
It is an insidious thing that they're doing.
Yes, it is.
Okay? And to a lesser extent, this is also true in the Protestant churches that have very elaborate doctrines of ecclesiastical authority, like the Presbyterians or the Lutherans, okay?
Yeah.
You have a similar situation there. Because, again, the goal is to put the faithful, the people sitting on the fence, in the position where they have to make the choice between schism or heresy.
Oh, gee.
You see?
Yeah.
That's the insidious nature of it. So you have quite literally a situation where, like in a secular revolution, such as occurred in Russia, you have a group of people that seize the institutional centers of authority and then make use of the trappings of that authority to institute a revolution.
Wow. Yeah.
That's what's going on in the churches.
Oh, gee, Joseph. Well, what position, if you're a Nazi, you care very much about what's going on there, I would imagine.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So what position would they like to see come about?
They would be very similar in their goals for the churches. I mean, you have only to look at what the Nazis did in Nazi Germany vis-a-vis the Roman Catholic Church, and then vis-a-vis the majority Lutheran Church in Germany.
Yeah.
For one thing, the Nazis funded them very heavily.
Yeah.
You know, there's even a speech by Adolf Hitler to the effect that, you know, we are not enemies of religion, just look at how much money we give to these churches. We've increased the previous state allotments for them, okay? So, to a certain extent, you have to understand that the Nazis were well aware of the role of the churches in creating a stable German culture, okay? This is why, to a certain extent, they were supporters of it. And, you know, the Nazis went a step further. They reached that concordat with the Vatican, negotiated kind of a treaty that basically the Vatican stepped out of any public statements against the Nazi regime and its foreign policy. Okay, in return for the Nazi government basically leaving the Roman Church and its institutions and properties and so on inside of Nazi Germany alone. All right?
Yeah.
So to a certain extent, the gun was to the papacy's head during the war.
Yeah.
So they had to, by the nature of the case, to walk a very, very careful political tightrope. Okay? I'm not trying to excuse them for some of the things they did. I'm just trying to indicate what the nature of the beast was that was going on between the two. But the other thing that the Nazis ultimately wished, I think, was, if you read carefully some of the statements of Himmler, Hitler, and so on and so forth, was that they certainly wanted to get their hands on the Roman Church and change it. So in this respect, ultimately, their goals were no different than, say, the 19th century Grand Orient Freemasons and so on and so forth. They certainly wanted to infiltrate and eventually to change and hollow out from within. Okay? And the rat line, you see, this is the hidden story here. The rat line operation, I don't think, has ever been investigated from the standpoint of what sort of ecclesiastical and theological effect did this activity have on the internal policy of the Vatican. Why is it that we have two of the major contenders after the big Reform Council of Vatican II is underway? Why are two of the major contenders, Giuseppe Cardinal Siri and Giovanni Cardinal Montini, the major contenders for the papal office? And why do we have now a German pope?
Very interesting. And why is the head of Germany a physicist?
Exactly. You know, the College of Cardinals, I've said this before in the other series of these talks, and I'll say it again, and I used to say this to my students in my history classes, in my teaching days. The oldest and most experienced political chancery on the face of the earth is the Vatican. Bar none. They have centuries of diplomatic and political experience. They have the world's largest on-the-ground human intelligence network.
Well, Joseph, there's not a government on the face of this planet that has what amounts to embassies in every country.
Every country, exactly. That's my point. This is the oldest political chancery on the face of the earth. And these people are not stupid.
Right.
When a papal conclave meets to elect a pope, they choose extremely carefully.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? Now, the reason I stress this is that after John Paul II's death, during the period of the run-up to the conclave, and even really prior to John Paul II's election, you had many people in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain in the major media organs putting out the thought that this might be the time for an American pope.
Yes.
Or a Canadian pope.
I remember.
Okay, you remember that?
Yes.
In other words, the Anglo-American elite cranked up their media organs and were pushing it. Mm-hmm. Okay? What happened, however, was that in the last two papal conclaves, you had the election, basically, of European Unionists. Okay?
Okay.
Especially in the case of Cardinal Wojtyla, John Paul II. Mm-hmm. But with the election of Cardinal Ratzinger as Benedict XVI, you have the election of Wojtyla's theological hitman.
Yeah.
Okay? And remember what Ratzinger, the so-called conservative, did. He was the one that finally pushed for and got the excommunication of Archbishop Lefebvre and his Latin Rite Roman Catholic traditionalists.
Yeah.
Okay? So, this is not a man to think of as a traditionalist, even though he has chosen or returned to a traditional papal name. Yeah, it's very interesting. You have, in the last two papal conclaves, you have the College of Cardinals signaling their clear indication that no, we're not going with the Third World Pope. No, we're not going with a Chinese Pope. No, we're not going with an American Pope or a Latin American Pope. Okay?
Yeah.
We're going with Europe. So again, take that as an indicator that this factional infighting is not going all the Anglo-American elite's way.
Absolutely. Oh, my goodness, Joseph. It just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. I mean, we've got thousands of years of secrets.
Right.
And I say this every time, thousands of years, and the people themselves, I mean, just ordinary people like me, like my neighbor, whatever.
Right.
People don't seem to get any smarter. They don't seem to catch on.
Well,
to being manipulated, to
right.
being, the mind control kind of thing that goes on.
It's largely because you have a complacent media that's no longer really a media.
Yeah.
And you have a complacent academia. American education is some of the most academically fraudulent in the world. And I say that as a product of it. But, it is nonetheless true. The people that I saw when I was teaching, God bless them, there were some bright spots.
Yeah.
But by and large, I have to say that it was so frustrating to me because these basically good and intelligent people had been so utterly denuded of any critical faculty and ability to think. They did not even know basics of history that I had learned as a matter of course in elementary and junior high, let alone high school, let alone college. We are dealing with some of the most dumbed down people on the face of the planet.
Oh, I know. And isn't it scary living on a planet with so many dumb people?
Well, here's the point. Wait a minute. Whoa. You go to Europe. You go to Russia.
Oh, yeah.
You go to China.
You bet. Japan.
Japan, those people are not stupid.
Right.
Their educational systems still work.
Well, you know, Joseph, when I was in France, the little sidewalk cafes.
Yes.
Where you go and you have a coffee.
Yes.
I used to love that because
you can listen to the French.
Yes.
Yes, you listen to the French discussing issues of the day.
Oh, yes.
And they're not discussing at an American level.
Right.
They're discussing at a very detailed knowledge of things.
Oh,
A
yeah.
very sharp, critical, especially in Paris.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
You know, that's a French tradition.
Oh, yeah. But it was wonderful. It was exhilarating.
Yes, it was.
To be around people that
had more of a clue. That had
Yeah.
more of a clue what was going on in the USA than the Americans do.
No fooling.
Oh,
That
yeah,
is true.
absolutely. And yes, I wholeheartedly agree. It takes stepping outside of this country to see how bad things really are.
Joseph, most of the world is outside of this country.
Yeah, that's the point.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the point. And, you know, even go across the border to Canada and you get a very different perspective.
Oh, yes.
Or to Australia.
Yes.
You know, you get at least a much more informed populace.
Mm-hmm.
Because they have a much longer and older tradition within European cultures of some critical thought.
Right.
So that's a much more difficult population in a certain sense to manipulate. You know, one of the things I used to do as a professor of history was to challenge people as to why the Nazi Party could even come to power in a country as sophisticated as Germany.
Yeah.
Exactly what were they telling them? What was the lie that made that country buy a regime like that?
Yeah.
And trust me, it was not anything that was at a Tom Brokaw, Dan Rather, Walter Cronkite level.
Well, you look at the rallies of Nuremberg. Look at the faces of the women in the audience. I mean, they're orgasmic.
Well, it's beyond that. You have to be able to in a country like that, with the elites that were in power, the aristocracy, the intellectual classes, and so on and so forth, you have to have had some ability to play on the details of German history in a way that would make them buy it. You see, so it was not a propaganda effort. You have to understand this, and I'm so glad you raised this comparison to America. Dr. Goebbels' propaganda ministry, the whole Nazi propaganda machine, was not this American spin network.
Yeah.
Because they had a considerably more sophisticated population that they had to spin.
Yeah.
It was not a dumbed-down population by any means,
right.
Okay? So you have to look at the way the Nazis did this very, very carefully. They would have had a field day over here in modern America, had the situation been similar, because we are some of the dumbest people. The theological illiteracy alone in this country is appalling. Okay?
You're right.
That's why we have all of these Bible and Bible-only sects popping up, one a minute.
Yeah, and they don't want to know anything.
And they don't want to know anything else.
Yeah.
Because, that's all tradition, that's the Pope, and all of this nonsense.
Yeah.
They're afraid to investigate history and to challenge their own beliefs in the light of it. And if you're afraid of that with religion, imagine what you are in terms of economic history. Imagine what you are in terms of political history.
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. It's no wonder that these so-called two political parties get away with what they do time after time after time.
Yeah.
Because the portion of the population that thinks that they're still making a difference buys into this stupid system to begin with.
Yes, exactly.
So
exactly.
It's just appalling, and in some ways I'm like you. I miss that aspect of living in Europe.
Yes.
Because
I loved that.
Yeah, it's a different. It's really hard to communicate unless you've been over there.
Yeah.
To experience, to communicate what it's like.
Right.
because, you will get people on the street coming up and asking you this detailed question about American politics or policies, and you're dumbfounded that this is coming from someone that, isn't even really interested in politics.
Yeah.
Let alone American politics.
Yeah.
But they're so well informed. And the further east you go, the worse it gets. I mean, you try a Russian sometimes, let alone the French.
I know. And in Germany, at night, after people eat, they like to congregate at the little pubs.
Yes,
and
talk.
Yes, and boy, they get heated.
Oh, yes.
Conversations are very passionate.
Oh, yes, they do.
About politics and religion.
Yes, they do.
And it's exciting to listen.
It really is. That you're right. This kind of pub conversation is very much a part of European culture, and people just really don't get it.
Yeah.
And the Italians are the same way, the Spanish are the same way, and it's no wonder governments over there have to tread carefully.
Yeah.
Because at the slightest drop of a hat, they'll have a riot on their hands.
Oh,
yeah. And they'll do something about it. When was the last time? The French are always rioting, and I kind of look at this with a little bit of admiration, because they riot over the littlest things in France. Okay. When was the last time we had a riot here over something the government did or didn't do? We nearly had one with Katrina, but that was about it.
Oh, I know.
It's like we're sheep.
Yes.
We haven't a brain cell left as a culture. And to me, this is another signal that the Anglo-American elite is in trouble. They've spent so long dumbing us down that they're not going to have enough people that are smart enough to fix the airplanes, fix the elevators, repair broken or bad tissue, heal diseases, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And eventually, they're going to be cutting their own throat. You can't run a dictatorship without having competent people.
That's
so,
right.
if you want a dictatorship, Mr. Rockefeller, you'd better start pumping some money into some serious education in this country, not these foundations, not the National Education Association, and start by getting rid of teacher certification that you brought in back in the 19th century.
Yeah.
This is just all dumb.
Yes, it is. I agree with you. Oh, thousands and thousands of times over. I agree with all of that you've said. It's true. I've taken some college courses several years ago. Joseph, I didn't even have to crack the book.
Crack the book, I know. I know. The average American professor's idea of a lecture is to come in and summarize what's in the textbook.
Yeah.
That's it. We have no real professors left, in my opinion. There are a few, whatever you think of his politics or his positions, at least one thing Noam Chomsky can do is deliver a really good lecture. I know, because I've sat in on one.
Yeah.
When I was over in England.
Yeah.
You have very few people left that can do it in the grand old European style.
Yes.
But when I was in Oxford, I went to a theological lecture that my PhD mentor was giving for the university. And he proceeded to start out his lecture by saying, well, he'd forgotten all of his note cards at home, so he was going to have to extemporize. Mm-hmm. So without notes, without a textbook, with no overhead projector, no slide projector, no screen, no audio-visual aid, no film, no television, no internet. Okay?
Yeah.
He proceeded to give a 2.5-hour-long lecture from memory.
Oh, my goodness.
And hold everyone spellbound.
Spellbound, yeah.
Okay? I defy you to find within most American universities, in whatever faculty there is, more than maybe one person that can do that.
Oh.
Now, in America, we have the misbegotten notion that higher education is going to proceed on the Internet.
Oh.
You've got institutions like the University of Phoenix and so on and so forth, coming up with all these Internet courses. Mm-hmm. And I maintain that the essence of that kind of education at that level is the human element. It is that humanity that we're lacking in this country. Yes. And it's that ability to hand on a tradition, be it a tradition of economics, of literature, of history, of philosophy, whatever, that you can only get by sitting at the feet of someone who can do that.
That's right. That's exactly true.
And everybody else in the world knows this.
Yes, they do, and they laugh at us.
And they laugh at us.
Yeah.
They utterly, completely, totally. I mean, crack a Russian mathematics textbook. You know, the Dover Publishing Company in this country publishes a lot of Russian mathematical texts that were used inside the Soviet Union. You ought to read these things just to see what they're teaching undergraduates. You wouldn't get that stuff over here until the graduate level, if then. It's just unbelievable to me, Georgianne, what is happening in this country.
Oh, I know, Joseph. And, you know, they don't teach young people. To teach people in high school, and they should start them in grammar school, about economics. Oh, no, verboten, man.
You should teach foreign languages starting in elementary school.
Yes.
Not in high school.
Well, do you know in Europe what they do?
That's exactly what they do.
You say you live in Germany and I live in France and we have sons. We trade our sons for the summer so they hear the language spoken in the country, you know?
Yes.
And it's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, you know, from time to time I get asked to do an interview for this little radio show out of Sweden. Internet radio show based in Sweden. Mm-hmm. And these guys speak, you know, they speak English with a Swedish accent, but they speak English.
Yes.
Correctly.
Yes.
Proper grammar and everything.
Yeah.
And, you know, I can't find this with American students.
Right.
So, you know, again, we are in, you know, Nazi International and everything else aside. Mm-hmm. New World Order conspiracies and what have you, all that aside, we are in one big mess.
No fooling, Joe.
Throwing more money at it ain't the solution. The solution is the whole idea of teacher certification, number one.
Right.
Get rid of this monopoly that a bunch of idiots who specialize in something called education rather than a discipline or disciplines. Mm-hmm. Who specialize in child psychology and teaching methods rather than teaching itself.
Yeah.
Okay? Get rid of this whole notion. Can it?
Yes.
Okay?
Immediately.
When I went to and did my PhD in England, they were just beginning to introduce some of these types of courses at Oxford. This was in the 1980s. Just beginning to introduce them. And I kept telling my British friends, do not do this.
Yeah.
Your system is fine the way it is. Right. It's worked for 1,000 years. Don't fix what isn't broken.
Amen to that one, boy. That's true. That is true. Oh, Joseph, God bless you for coming on and spending this time with
Sure,
listeners.
Thank you for having me back.
Oh, anytime. We have a series to do here on these dirty secrets.
Well, there's lots more.
There's a lot of dirty secrets. And they spread far and wide over the millennia. So anyway, everybody, go to GizaDeathStar.com. There is a PayPal button there. Make use of it. Joseph P. Farrell has... when is your book on the Philosopher's Stone coming out, Joseph?
Well, the last I heard from Adam Parfrey over at Farrell House, which is the publisher that's doing that one, he indicated to me he was trying to bring it out in time for me to do this conference I've got to do down in Laughlin, Nevada next month.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining around February 15th as kind of a target date, give or take a few days. It should be out fairly quickly.
Right.
And I regret that I don't have a telephone number for Farrell House to order that, but I do note that the book is up at Amazon for pre-order. And they can Google Farrell House if they want to, F-E-R-A-L, to order the book directly from them. I imagine that by now they'd probably be taking pre-orders for that.
Yeah, I've got a link to it on your page at the Bite.
Oh, okay, good, excellent.
Yeah, and don't forget, when Joseph writes these books. They are written in an order for a reason.
Yep.
So you need to, if you want to dive in and study all this and come up to speed, you need to get all the books. And I'm telling you, they are amazing, Joseph. It's incredible the amount of information that's in these books.
Well, yeah, I do try and reference them. I do footnote rather extensively, and they are footnotes, so you can read them right at the bottom of the page. You don't have to flip back and forth.
Yeah.
But I do try and footnote. That's not saying I don't make mistakes or let things get by me every now and then, and I have a nice readership that lets me know when I do that, and I attempt to post their comments on my website, because, I certainly have nothing to gain by not pointing out mistakes, but they're relatively few and far between, and I do reference things so that you can check things out yourself, or if you want to do more research on your own, or look at the same things a different way and put together a different type of picture. That's also what the footnotes are there for. But I do try and reference, and when I'm speculating, I don't always succeed, but I do try and point out to the readers of the books that, well, here I'm speculating on the basis of this and that information. So it's but they are written in a certain order. It's not that you can't dive in at any point and start at one place and end up at another. But people that have read all of them tell me that it's easiest to read them in the order that they were written and the order I intended.
Well, they build on each other.
Yes, they do. They build on each other quite a bit, and I do that very intentionally because there are places I want to get to before I hang up the pen. I've got 2 books in the works right now, so I try and project things down the road quite a bit. So.
Okay. So anyway, I think that everybody needs to acquaint themselves with all of these books because they do build on each other, and to dive in at the end it kind of leaves you bewildered, I think, if you don't understand what's been going on all along.
Right.
And but your books they're a real gift, and you should be nominated as a national treasure. You really should.
Well, thank you.
Oh.
I could at least be nominated for a part in a movie about national treasure.
Then, Joseph, we could go to France and sit there and drink coffee.
Coffee on the Seine.
Yes, and talk to people.
Right.
That would be great. Oh, my goodness. Okay, everybody. God bless you all for listening. Joseph and I really do have more fun than people ought to when we're doing these. They're not really interviews, Joseph. They're grand conversations.
Yeah, that they are.
Okay. So God bless you all for listening. This is Georgianne Hughes on The Bite Show with Joseph P. Farrell. Getting ready to sign off. You can email Joseph at V as in Victor, ARDAS, and then the number 3 at AOL.com. And in the subject line, put whatever the subject is in capital letters.
Absolutely.
Yes, that way your email won't get dumped.
Right.
Okay. So, good night, everybody, and we will be back, God willing, with part 3. Good night. Say good night, Joseph.
Good night.